All right. I believe that the most probable reason that John came to be accepted in Catholic circles is due to its doctrine of a spiritual kingdom. John offered a plausible explanation for why the synoptic end time prophecies were not fulfilled at the end of the apostolic age. John offered the explanation that the spiritual nature of Jesus' message was misunderstood, and that Jesus had actually referred to a spiritual kingdom and not to the literal kingdom of which the other gospels seem to describe. The logical inconsistencies in some of these passages seems to be evidence of tampering, where Catholic scribes make Jesus out to be pro-Moses and pro-Jewish, with an overall bias, and John clearly lays elsewhere. John also appealed to the Orthodox Christians because Jesus is said to be the Logos made flesh. To some, this may seem anti-Gnostic, but then again, it is wrong to assume that all Gnostics had a strictly defined dogma of Jesus, the Logos, as a non-material being. In both the Tripartite Tractate and in Hippolytus' account of the Nascenes, one can find examples of a son and a Logos, that is, a threefold being, but the source of a spiritual, natural soul and material elements in the lower universe. It may also seem anti-Gnostic when Jesus says, "In secret I have said nothing," but this is not inconsistent with anything that Marcion said. And one may also answer that the Gnostic import of secrets lay within the revelation of the Paraclete. By this point, it would be yet another exercise in repetition to explain why the Gnostics found John to be meaningful. Stated simply, the theology in John is anything but orthodox, and a clumsy effort of Catholics to modify a gospel are still evidence in chapters 4 and 5. The unorthodox themes in John indicate that, in its original form, that the Gospel of John may have well been the earliest of the Gnostic Gospels. So, and eventually we'll work our way to more of the history that John and stuff worked his way into the text, and that's one thing I do want to point out. The the way I'm starting to see the canon, anyway, the way it's put together, is that I think it's a lot later than people are trying to attribute it to. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the when you do look at the fall of the temple, the Jews and the Christians were going to the same churches, where they were going to the temple, they were going to synagogue. And then you had Paul writing his letters pointing out that people should study the scriptures daily, and you know what I mean, stuff like that. So it makes sense to me that there may not have really been any, if not many, gospels floating around. And then after 70, you see a lot of these gospels, and they pop up in Greek. They were reading Hebrew in the synagogue. The Septuagint was not used in the synagogue, it was used outside. And you see these weird little lines in the tradition, as Jerome says that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew, and they did the best they could to translate it. And so, and it does make sense. I mean, everybody holds the tradition that Matthew was written to the Jews, right? So it may have been in Hebrew or Aramaic. And that's the next thing I'm going to look into going forward with some of these other concepts. But I don't know how well known Christianity was outside of those areas. One, two, I don't know if there really would have been a necessity to write gospels per se at these earlier dates. And I'm not saying it's impossible. Like I said, I'm not. This is one of those things I couldn't prove one way or the other. But it does make sense to me if they're going to synagogues and they're being told to study their scriptures. No gospel was scripture. That's a fact. I don't even think Paul's letters would be considered as scripture in some senses. But they would take these teachings and study the scriptures to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. And I think that's where it kind of stopped. But I think once they're pushed out of the temples, now you have Jews and Christians trying to define themselves. And now maintaining this Jesus story takes on a whole nother element, and that is to write it down. So remember, Jesus' story was overall a oral tradition, I think, in the early years, no doubt. And you see this evidenced even with Luke, when he's going and interviewing all these people, trying to get these stories straight. He's hunting down an oral tradition. So I think that there's probably a later date to a lot of these, people forcing sometimes 50 and 40 on these texts, and I don't think it's the case. Is it possible? Yes, it absolutely is. I can't deny that. But it seems to make more sense to me that they did come later. And then some people would say, well, what about the events described in Revelations, per se, something like that, where it seems to be in some senses past tense, or things that have already happened that um, I would just simply point to the Midrash, okay? The oral law that was written down approximately 135, so this would have been 60, 70 years after 70 AD. It still speaks as if the temple is still standing. So I don't think this is an unusual quality that you will find in Jewish literature as far as passing down an oral tradition, because their memory of things was a lot better than ours. We don't have a habit of memorizing whole books, like Islam, for example. Um, and, let's face it, if all the Qurans were destroyed, I would say there's a strong chance, a good chance, that they would have versions of the Quran within a year, if not less, that were pretty good, probably, because it's their culture, it's what they do. And, these people were prized in Jewish society. They were prized, these guys who could recite whole big long chunks of scripture, and it was important. It was an art for them, and that art still is alive in that part of the world today in the Islamic tradition. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it. That's just a deeper look at some of the things that go around with John, and you know, it's I'm just throwing stuff out there personally. Um, believe what you believe. Just make sure that you've investigated it and prayed on it and done as much as you possibly can to make sure that it's right. So, on that note, God bless.